You see, the trick with these videos is to accept less than perfect. Kind of awful is my aesthetic. But, much like Bret Easton Ellis, I will continue to beat that aesthetic into the ground for all that it's worth.
I can't remember which American writer it was. I heard him speak and he said that his job is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable.
Welcome to Books You Haven't Read. New introductions. See, fun artwork back there that you can't really make out. Also, the Statler and Waldorf back there. You all, of course, know William Shakespeare. He's been moved from studio audience to the Peanut Gallery, and right next to him, of course, that is famous Danish architect Bjarke Ingels.
Fiction is to fantasize about how it could be. In that sense, architecture is the fiction of the real world.
It's called having heroes, okay? I work at an architecture company, so of course I have a famous architect. Please don't ask me to name any other famous architects. Francis Lloyd Coppola, I think that's it. That's the only other one I know. Speaking of heroes, Bret Easton Ellis, not a hero. But that's mainly because I've read everything he's written, and there's about as much good as there is bad. And today, I'm going to talk about that work, or at least, I'm just going to stick with his fiction. It's just going to be his 6 novels and his short story collection. Now, if I were being provocative, I might say something like, Bret Easton Ellis hasn't written anything good since the 1980s. I'll give him a little more grace than that, but not much. It's complicated. So I'll go through each of his books in chronological order of when they were published, and then I'll have some wrap-up thoughts at the end. We start off, of course, with 1985's Less Than Zero. So obviously, I've done a full review on this before from about just over 9 years ago. I have not rewatched that in years. I'm afraid to, but it's slightly awful, so if you want to go see a slightly awful review on Less Than Zero. First came across this book after I'd been reading a bunch of Douglas Copeland. Bret was considered like another voice of Generation X, and so it was a natural transition, but Bret Easton Ellis was supposed to have a little more edge to him, a little more grit. Reading that first paragraph, so distant and indirect, and yet it sort of expressed everything through a certain amount of lacking. So on my recent reread of this book, I was struck again by, and this seems obvious, of course, but by how much of a young person's novel this is. And not just because it's about young people, it's about an 18-year-old, mostly hanging out with other 18-year-olds. I don't think I could have come to this book at, say, age 30 like I did at age 20. I just don't think I would have found as much value in it. And that's a reminder that, we all come to books at a certain point in our life, and some books just hit us the right way, and this one really hit me the right way. So, what's this book about? Well, cocaine, mostly. Clay is our protagonist, and he is an 18-year-old college freshman that is back home for Christmas break. And this book looks at those 4 weeks when he's back kind of catching up with his old high school friends and, of course, back with his family. He lives in a very nice part of LA. He lives on Mulholland Drive, I believe, or just off of Mulholland Drive. So he's up in the hills. He is part of a larger cadre of just Beverly Hills youth that are, by and large, all kids of people that work high up in the entertainment industry. So these kids have access to anything and everything they want, whether it's fast cars, great drugs, or even worse stuff. If this were released today, I can almost guarantee that it would be billed as like a novel in flash fiction. Each scene is only like 2 pages, and so that makes it really easy to just burn through really quick. But it also creates a certain, almost pointillist, impression-like quality to it. The novel's about 200 pages long, but it's really strange because, for the first 150 pages, it's kind of a low-grade ambient, getting worse, dread is picking up, and then in those last 50 pages, it takes, 3 or 4 really crazy turns that become kind of hallmarks of what we'll call the Bret Easton Ellis shock and awe factor. The whole novel explores just the vacuity and violence, not just as like incidental to the world of the wealthy and the rich in Beverly Hills, but almost as essential to it, that there is not one without the other. I think this is where you should start with Bret Easton Ellis, but keep in mind as you read it that this was a book written by really a 20-year-old. It's blurbed by USA Today as being Catcher in the Rye for MTV Generation, and while that's a bit crude, it's like, kind of a good signpost. Side note, there was a Less Than Zero movie, and it's incredible because it's incredibly bad. Reserves only character names and really none of the story. So just check it out. It's awful. Which brings us to 1987's Rules of Attraction. This is in many ways kind of ground zero for a lot of the other stuff that happens in the Bret Easton Ellis universe. So there are three main characters that we follow, and they are Sean Bateman, brother of Patrick, Lauren Hindy, and Paul Denton. Though we do get a lot of different minor characters, including Clay, the protagonist from the previous novel, and this is the first sort of foray that Bret takes into self-parody, and we'll talk more about that, especially as we get into his later work. Broadly speaking, this novel is kind of a riff on, I want to call it a love triangle since we have three main characters, but really it's like a love octopus. Essentially what you need to know is that nobody is in love with the other person that's in love with them, right? No one is in love with the right person. In many ways, this is kind of the most adolescent novel of Bret Easton Ellis's career, which might make it objectively the best book in his career. Maybe it's even better to say that the adolescence that is recurrent throughout all of Bret's work is most at home here. This is the thing about all of his characters. They tend to be very adolescent and emotionally immature characters, and that works really well, I think, in a college novel. I generally just like kind of the college novel as a genre because of the weird ecosystem that universities and colleges can be. And that's really what this book is. It's this very interesting and rich ecosystem of Bret Easton Ellis characters all at college together. This could also be a great starting point with Bret Easton Ellis. I think if you don't start with Less Than Zero, start with this. And so now, of course, we have come to the magnum opus, American Psycho. I assume most people will know what this book is about, but for those that don't, Patrick Bateman is a Wall Street banker by day and a sadomasochistic serial killer by night. This book is famous for its, very gruesome and also honestly very creative depictions of torture and violence. But where I think this book really succeeds is that, so the book is about 400 pages long. In the first 100 pages, you're really not getting that much violence or gruesomeness. So it's really paced well and plays with the tension of your expectations of the novel, because you know it's going to be about awful and gruesome things, but it makes you wait and sort of work towards that. The other thing I want to talk about in regards to this novel are the comments that David Foster Wallace made on it in this interview that he did with Larry McCaffrey in the Review of Contemporary Fiction. I think this quote is going to serve as a really good hinge point for where we go when we look forward in Bret Easton Ellis's career. So I'll read this real quick. I think it's a kind of black cynicism about today's world that Ellis and certain others depend on for their readership. If what's always distinguished bad writing, flat characters, a narrative world that's cliched and not recognizably human, etc., is also a description of today's world, then bad writing becomes an ingenious mimesis of a bad world. If readers simply believe the world is stupid and shallow and mean, then Ellis can write a mean, shallow, stupid novel that becomes a mordant deadpan commentary on the badness of everything. You can defend American Psycho as being a sort of performative digest of late 80s social problems, but it's no more than that. So I want to disagree with the kind of way in that last sentence that he sort of dismisses out of hand this idea of American Psycho, because what American Psycho is a satire, and I am very pro-satire. I think the criteria that he uses in that interview can be used to kind of just dismiss any satire out of hand, and I don't think that's helpful. Satire allows us to feel a sort of catharsis of righteous anger, or put another way, it's kind of like the punk rock of literature, and I think that's great. I love that. Where I think Wallace gets it right, though, is in a more totalizing sense. Satires and irony and cynicism ultimately do kind of flatten that world. As you read more of these novels that are ultimately about a world that is stupid and shallow and mean, the returns on your reading investment become much lower. This is why I like to think of Bret Easton Ellis as like my Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. It's ultimately about just how grossly stupid and bad people are, and it's easy to identify moral failings, and that kind of makes us feel good. But it does ultimately end up sort of lacking that literary nutrition, as I like to think of it, that we get from the books that we really like. And so ultimately, I think Wallace's comments become this kind of prophetic burn on Ellis's career, because from Less Than Zero to American Psycho, we see a progression of a writer getting better and better, especially at this kind of satire thing. Going forward, though, it never feels like he breaks any new ground. He just gets more meta with it. And so ultimately, the returns that you get from Bret Easton Ellis are themselves diminishing because you don't feel like he's doing anything new. So this brings us now to his one short story collection, The Informers. I think of this book as kind of the literary equivalent of my favorite seedy dive bar. There's not a lot on the menu. You know what you're gonna get, but you're there because you like that specific kind of weirdness. The story goes that these were kind of developed around the same time while Bret was at Bennington. It's much more of a similar style. It's back to that kind of classic Bret Easton Ellis minimalism that I think he's much more good at. I think he's really good at maximalism in American Psycho, not so much in Glamorama. I think one of the main problems of this short story collection is that it really lacks a defining story, or maybe I should say it lacks a defining good story. Most readers that have read this, there's kind of a story that defines it, because you're like, wait, he did what with this? It's the one with vampires. Bret actually makes a really funny joke about it in Imperial Bedrooms. And this book was ultimately, I should also say, adapted into a movie. I think it came out in 2008, and even Bret Easton Ellis doesn't like it, and he was like one of the screenwriters on it. My favorites out of this collection are probably the first one, which is Bruce Calls from Mulholland. There's one called Discovering Japan. That's one of the longer ones, and I think it's probably the best overall. And then I liked Letters from Los Angeles, and then the last one, which is I think called Bruce and I Go to the Zoo. If you've read the prior three novels at this point, I don't know if you'll get much new out of it, but again, it's that kind of literary dive bar. It's a comfort zone. Most of the stories are going to deal with asymmetrical relationships. There's violence in some of them. There's quasi-semi-famous people in others, and it's just kind of a big collage of sort of what you feel like are the leftovers of maybe Less Than Zero. The nice thing is that there's not really a lot of high praise for this collection. It's mostly competent. I don't think Bret needs to write another short story collection. This one's fine. So I think credit is due to him for at least not writing another worse collection. Oh, and now we finally come to the book I hate the most in the Bret Easton Ellis canon, Glamorama. Longtime viewers of the channel might remember that I did a Glamorama video at one point. I've since taken it down, mostly because I don't stand by that video anymore. I don't stand by the quality of the video or the review. I do stand by the sentiment. I still hate this book. I actually really got into this novel for about the first 100 pages. The problem is that it's like 550. This novel concerns Victor Ward, who is a side character that Lauren Hindy was really into in Rules of Attraction. He is a model living in New York City. He is kind of the it boy of the moment, and he is opening up his own nightclub. And right as he's kind of ostensibly hitting his peak, he is recruited by this mysterious figure named Fred Palicon to go find a missing old college classmate of his who has infiltrated a terrorist cell comprised of high-end fashion models. A fun fact about this book is that if you've ever seen the movie Zoolander, you'll notice the plots are kind of similar. You know, male models that are recruited into terrorist cells. I believe Bret or the publishing house reached some kind of financial settlement because there was a lawsuit over whether Zoolander had basically taken the premise from Glamorama. There are a number of problems that I have with this book. The first one is that the terrorism that the supermodels are doing is kind of just as an aesthetic. There's no like ideological reason behind why they're committing these acts of terror. The terror exists merely for spectacle. It feels like there are no rules to the logic or reality of this novel. I mean, you can think of the surrealism, the documentary crew, the flies that Victor's always swatting. You can think of the surrealism as an extension of Victor's stupidity, but then that just kind of feels lazy to me. To bring it back to the movie Zoolander, Derek Zoolander as he exists in that movie is a funny, stupid character that exists in a funny, stupid, absurd world. This character, Victor, is a funny, stupid, ditzy character that exists in like an attempt at a Robert Ludlum spy thriller novel world. The comically dumb pretty boy model is ultimately not a good character in a spy novel, unless that spy novel is comic in tone, and it's not. So it feels like the novel ends inconclusively after giving you zero stakes because you were led around for 500 pages by a fucking moron. Obviously, I have strong opinions on this. Your mileage may vary. I feel like if you came to this novel first, you would have a radically different reading experience from me. But again, kind of in light of those Wallace comments, it shows us a stupid, shallow, mean world, and it's like, aren't male models idiots? It's like, okay, so what? Which brings us to the moment in Bret's career where he decides he's not going to attempt anything new, he's just going to get more meta with it. Lunar Park. The first chapter in this book is honestly one of the most enjoyable parts of the Bret Easton Ellis canon, because it's Bret making fun of himself. So he gives this gauche fictionalization of his life, though he does use like real details, including the fact that I guess he was hammered or drugged up for most of his tour for Glamorama. He ends up in like drug rehab and alcohol rehab, finally gets his life together so that he can marry this woman who is a former actress, kind of an 80s Brat Pack type. So by the present of the novel, they have sort of split up at one point and then got back together. There is the two of them, and then he's got a biological son and a stepdaughter. The family lives in a fictional suburb of New York City, where Bret is a writing professor at the local college, and he is starting or having or attempting to have an affair with one of his students because, of course, he is. The rest of the book is more or less a pretty trite and campy horror story from there, with different Bret Easton Ellis characters sort of manifesting themselves into the real life of Bret Easton Ellis. You've got Patrick Bateman out there is committing murders, and you've got a detective, Donald Kimball, who's the detective in American Psycho, and he shows up in this novel as well, interrogating Bret. And then you have Bret's house starts to become haunted, but of course, because in this novel, Bret is an alcoholic and a recovering drug addict, his family doesn't believe him, so the tension escalates with that. And so it becomes this haunted house novel, this mystery of why is this house haunted exactly. You know, just personally speaking, I'm not the audience for that. I've always found horror movies and horror books, the limited number that I've consumed, to be just kind of tedious and boring. It's also a novel about fathers and sons, and comes from, as I understand it, a pretty personal place for Bret Easton Ellis, because he wrote this book kind of in reaction to his own father dying. It's going to be, you know, different for every reader. If you're someone that likes this, if you're someone that likes Stephen King books, I imagine you would like this book as well. And that'll bring us to the final novel of the video, his follow-up to his debut novel, Less Than Zero, called Imperial Bedrooms. Fun fact about this actual copy of the book, I bought this from a Borders, because Borders was still a thing when I bought this. The plot is that this book is narrated by the real Clay. The previous Clay from Less Than Zero was actually just an insert for the real-life Bret Easton Ellis, and who stole all of the events of this Clay's life and made him into a lightly fictionalized novel. So on the one hand, it like kind of immediately and completely invalidated the narrative structure or the narrative reality of Less Than Zero. But on the other hand, it got me used to disappointing novels by Bret Easton Ellis. So, Roses and Thorns. Like Lunar Park, this novel's first chapter is really enjoyable because of all the very first sentence is they made a movie about us. And so all of, not just Clay, but all of the other characters are now kind of living in the shadow of what this movie did to the rest of their lives. Not coincidentally, all of the characters more or less work in Hollywood or Hollywood adjacent, as their parents were in Less Than Zero. Julian's back, and he's like a high-class pimp and also like an agent for young actors. You've got Trent, who's also married to Blair, and they're both like producers and writers. And then you've got Rip, who's actually not in Hollywood, though I think he's probably like a drug dealer to a lot of Hollywood. He apparently like owns his own cartel, which, alright. The biggest new addition is this character named Rain, who is the object of desire for Clay. And not only the object of desire for Clay, but also of Rip and Julian. She's Julian's girlfriend, and also Rip has sex with her at some point, probably for drugs. And so basically Clay is telling this woman that he's going to cast her in this movie, even though she has terrible acting skills, and sort of the tension of all three of those guys, pining or desiring her leads to the action of the novel. It's kind of a Raymond Chandler-esque noir, but a very self-indulgent Bret Easton Ellis spin on it. And really, you can only appreciate it if you've read prior work by Ellis. Again, not a lot of moral complication in these characters. They all generally suck, except now they're older, so it's kind of like when Billy Ray Cyrus made that remix of Achy Breaky Heart, that hip-hop remix. We didn't need it, and it was just kind of sad, a little amusing, but also sad. The ultimate achievement of this novel is to make you feel like you're in on the joke, that you understand all the references that are being dropped. And I do have to give Bret points on one thing. Early on, Clay is talking about this movie, The Listeners, that he's doing, and he's pithily remarking about how it's not even that good of a movie. The reasoning he gives for it not being a good movie is he says, there's vampires in it. And that's legitimately funny. Bret Easton Ellis knows that vampires suck, and he's not wrong. Ultimately, for me, the genre of noir is more compelling and interesting than like the genre of horror, but it just feels like he's doing a slightly different iteration of Lunar Park. The difference being that instead of being meta with the author, he's being, meta with the character. It's so short, it's hard to be mad at it, but I find that the story was ultimately just kind of forgettable. Not bad, just meh, forgettable. So those are my thoughts on the novels of Bret Easton Ellis, the novels and the short story collection. I still think Bret Easton Ellis is worth getting into, especially his earlier stuff. I also think it matters the order in which you read. For my own part, I read Less Than Zero, then Rules of Attraction, then Imperial Bedrooms, then American Psycho, Lunar Park, The Informers, and Glamorama. Out of those, I think Rules of Attraction, for me, has aged best. I think I initially gave it about 4 stars. It's 5 stars easily for me now. Like I've said, best starting points, I think, are going to be Less Than Zero or Rules of Attraction, and I would suggest doing The Informers kind of right with one of those as well. And definitely go up to American Psycho. And then after that, Glamorama, Lunar Park, Imperial Bedrooms, you're not missing anything if you skip out on them. There's something apocalyptic about those first 3 novels, but the problem is that the effectiveness of that kind of aesthetic is ultimately blunted when, it's been 30 years since American Psycho and the apocalypse hasn't come, which I think just serves as another example that Bret Easton Ellis really is kind of a young person's writer. I think young people tend to feel, especially across generations, just more apocalyptic in general. If I were to try and sum up Bret Easton Ellis, he's somewhere of a mix between punk rock literature and, trashy reality TV. And look, we all gotta have our indulgences, and so thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful. All of these are just my opinions, and if you care really hard about them, yell at me in the comments. I probably deserve it. Till next time, goodbye.